Alright guys, I gotta rant a little bit because I got some stuff here I just gotta get off my chest. The whole Qasem Soleimani thing, it just doesn't add up to me. I've said before that I don't think that the US is really actually trying to push for a war in Iran, nor is Israel really for a full-scale war in Iran, so much as they want to contain Iran because Iran is ready for the Belt and Road Initiative. That's what Israel wants, and Iran is going to play its part. But this whole thing with Qasem Soleimani, all this stuff about how I'm hearing a lot of stuff, seeing a lot of stuff about how he's been responsible for a lot of deaths of soldiers, whether directly or indirectly, in Iraq and in the Iraq War and stuff like that. And but they never give examples or specific details. They just say like, well, he's responsible for the deaths for a lot of U.S. soldiers and civilians, but they won't give any details or specific events or anything like that. And that usually means it's probably bullshit. And I'm going to start you off with this article here. Trump on Soleimani strike. His reign of terror is over. In brief remarks in his Mar-a-Lago resort in South Africa, Trump said Soleimani, who commanded Iran's Quds Force, had been caught in the act planning imminent and sinister attacks on American diplomats and military personnel. So, you're never going to get any details about this. This is just a justification. It's the same, the way they're talking is the exact same way that they were talking when they just knew that Assad did those chemical attacks, and we all know that was bullshit. They're using the same type of speak and language and vagueness that they always use when they're bullshitting about something. And there was another article somewhere talking about how apparently he had these plans up his sleeve that he was going to unleash any second that was going to kill thousands of American and European civilians and all this shit. Yeah, I totally buy that. We caught him in the act and terminated him, Trump said in a brief address. His reign of terror is over. What the United States did yesterday should have been done a long time ago. A lot of lives would have been saved, Trump said, adding that the Iranian general had made the death of innocent people his sick passion. For years, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its ruthless Quds Force under Soleimani's leadership has targeted, injured, and murdered hundreds of American civilians and servicemen. The recent attacks on U.S. targets in Iraq, including rocket strikes that killed an American and injured 4 American servicemen very badly, as well as a violent assault on our embassy in Baghdad, were carried out at the direction of Soleimani, Trump said. Of course, we're not seeing any evidence for that. We're probably never going to see any evidence for that. And as I go on and on about this, when I start to read, I'm going to go into the guy's military history here soon, and you're going to see how this really doesn't make any fucking sense at all. But here's where it really gets gold. We took action last night to stop a war. We did not take action to start a war, he said. We do not seek regime change. However, the Iranian regime's aggression in the region, including the use of proxy fighters to destabilize its neighbors, must end. The use of proxy fighters to destabilize its neighbors. Now, where have we seen that? I mean, it's not like we just went through a long spree of arming multiple groups of Salafi and Wahhabi extremist fighters to completely tear up Libya and Syria and destabilize the region to overthrow leaders we didn't like. It's not like we didn't also see Israel going over there and giving aid and medical supply to al-Nusra fighters in Syria also. The proxy fighters that he's referring to from Iran were fighting the terrorists that we were arming to overthrow Syria. They went in there to help defend Assad, protect the Christians from the terrorists that we were arming who were slaughtering Christians. And then we turn around and say that they're the number one state sponsor of terror. How does that make any fucking sense? And then you have Donald Trump here, the fucking fraud, using that same type of rhetoric. He knows better. He's not an idiot. He talked about the problems that we were arming terrorists in Libya and Syria during his election cycle. So he knows better than this bullcrap. But you can read in Soleimani's Wikipedia page his military career. Here's something I found really interesting under the tab Command of the Quds Force. Following the September 11 attacks in 2001, Ryan Crocker, a senior State Department official in the United States, flew to Geneva to meet with Iranian diplomats who were under the direction of Soleimani with the purpose of collaborating to destroy the Taliban, which had targeted Shia Afghanis. This collaboration was instrumental in defining the targets of bombing operations in Afghanistan and in capturing key al-Qaeda operatives, but abruptly ended in January 2002 when President George W. Bush named Iran as part of the axis of evil in his State of the Union address. Now that's interesting. According to several sources, including Riyad Hijab, a former Syrian premier who defected in August 2012, he was also one of the most staunchest supporters of the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad in the Syrian civil war. In the later half of 2012, Soleimani assumed personal control of the Iranian intervention in the Syrian civil war, when Iranians became deeply concerned about the Assad government's lack of ability to fight the opposition and the fallout to the Islamic Republic if the Syrian government fell. He was reported to have coordinated the war from a base in Damascus. Soleimani was much credited in Syria for the strategy that assisted President Bashar al-Assad in finally repulsing rebel forces and recapture key cities and towns. He was involved in the training of government-allied militias and the coordination of decisive military offensives. Here's some stuff on his operations in Iraq against ISIS, which he worked with U.S. Special Forces, from what I understand, in Iraq to fight ISIS. And in both Syria and Iraq, he's considered one of the most important and pivotal people in the fight against ISIS. Qasem Soleimani was in the Iraqi city of Amirli to work with the Iraqi forces to push back militants from ISIL. According to the Los Angeles Times, which reported that Amirli was the first town to successfully withstand an ISIS invasion, it was secured thanks to an unusual partnership of Iraqi and Kurdish soldiers, Iranian-backed Shiite militias, and U.S. warplanes. The U.S. acted as a force multiplier for a number of Iranian-backed armed groups at the same time that was present on the battlefield. A senior Iraqi official told the BBC that when the city of Mosul fell, the rapid reaction of Iran rather than American bombing was what prevented a more widespread collapse. Qasem Soleimani also seems to have been instrumental in planning the operation to relieve Amirli and Saladin governorate, where ISIL had laid siege to an important city. In fact, the Quds Force operatives under Soleimani's command seem to have been deeply involved with not only the Iraqi army and Shiite militias, but also the Kurdish in the Battle of Amirli. Hadi al-Amiri, the former Iraqi Minister of Transportation and the head of the Badr organization, highlighted the pivotal role of General Qasem Soleimani in defending Iraq's Kurdistan region against ISIL, and he added, "There would be no Iraq if General Soleimani hadn't helped us." So basically what was just described there was, if it wasn't for Soleimani, Iraq probably would have completely failed to ISIS. And so when you hear this, and you hear about this guy being like this sort of general pattern in the war against ISIS in both Syria and Iraq, this whole stuff about how he just starts firing rockets into U.S. embassies like some kind of rogue maniac type guy and doing all this weird stuff, all of a sudden that doesn't really make any sense. But here's something that might interest you that sort of pulls in some light about this. It's an article by globalresearch.ca that was put out on the 25th of March 2019. U.S. policy failure reopens Iraqi-Syrian borders and the Iran-Beirut road. The imminent removal of the ISIS threat provided the occasion for an unusual meeting. Iranian Chief of Staff Major General Mohammad Bakeri, Syrian Defense Minister Ali Abdullah Ayyub, the Iraqi Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Othman al-Ghanmi, met in the Syrian capital Damascus and decided to reopen the borders between Iraq and Syria. Trump and his generals recognized their mistake in creating a safe passage for Iran and Iraq into Syria by removing ISIS from that area. The presence of ISIS made it impossible for Iranian and Iraqi nationals and goods to travel safely to Syria. This realization led to the U.S. decision to leave several hundred U.S. members of the armed forces behind. Thanks to the U.S. move, Iran can now send all needed support and resume commerce with Syria at a time when Israel has been bombing Damascus airport to try and slow down the resupply of the Syrian army with precision missile and other military equipment needed to rebuild the army's defense force. So fuck that. Why does Israel need to bomb Syria? Well, we know for a fact that Israel also gives aid and medical care to terrorists, including al-Nusra in Syria. They want Assad out because he's not a pro-Zionist puppet. And it looks to me that the reason why Soleimani had such a target on his head was because he was the number one guy in helping to keep Assad into power. And we know that throughout the civil war in Syria, Israel was constantly doing airstrikes on Syrian military targets and also had a very strong habit of targeting Iranian generals who were there helping the Syrian government fight the terrorists who were backed by the U.S. and Israel. And so when Iran and Hezbollah go and fight the dozen or so Salafi extremist groups that we armed, that had open ties to Al-Qaeda and were butchering Christians, we then turn around and say, look at Iran sponsoring these Shia groups, fighting these groups that we arm. Iran is the number one state sponsor of terror. They're all a bunch of fucking liars and hypocrites. I also just saw a video that was shared by Pompeo showing people celebrating that Soleimani was killed. And it was like 12 people in the video. And then someone responded to it by showing the procession of the funeral for Soleimani that's taking place in Iraq right now, or had taken place, and it's like literally hundreds of thousands of people. It looked like there was maybe 200,000, maybe 300,000 people there, and that's the feeling that has been brewed up in response to this against the U.S. That is how much more unsafe it is for U.S. soldiers in Iraq right now. Now U.S. soldiers are the most hated people in Iraq right now. I think that might be what this is really about. This move isn't about trying to start a war with Iran. It's about just making the U.S. as hated as absolutely possible. And then eventually the U.S. will be pushed out. And then China will come in and be like, oh yeah, they were real mean to you. Here, get in on this Belt and Road thing, buddy. And I think that's really what it's all about. It's just really weird. It's all a big freaking game, and that's all I have to say about that. That's the end of my rant. Hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned because I'll start releasing scripted videos soon. I have some stuff written down and planned, but I just haven't got onto it yet. Thank you very much.